Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast. This is episode number 54. I'm here with Tiago Faleiro. Tiago, do you want to introduce yourself and tell the listeners about your work in the health and fitness industry?
Hey, so thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. So my name is Tiago. I've been working in the fitness industry for like 10 years, I suppose, more or less. And so, once I first got into fitness, I was very enthusiastic about it, like many people are. And then I just started learning about it because I'm a huge nerd. And so I got into the science of things. And then eventually, started coaching people to try to help them reach their fitness goals in terms of nutrition and training. And so I still do that to this day. So I've been coaching, ever since. I coach both kind of like average people just trying to get fitter, and I also coach powerlifters and bodybuilders. And then on top of that, I also am part of the Renaissance periodization team, and I help them with a variety of things. And yeah, that's me in a nutshell regarding fitness.
Nice. Yeah. I remember we met back in, I think it was 2018 in Dublin at the RP seminar. That was a lot of fun. And it was interesting how everyone, you see someone online and you're kind of like, I wonder what they're like in person. And everyone was like really, from the RP team, especially you, very friendly. So that was a really good experience. And then we've just stayed in touch ever since. And I really respect the work you do. As I said offline, you don't have a whole lot of content, but the stuff you do have is like, very trustworthy. And it's quite practical. I love to see content that's kind of not like following fads, sort of timeless, evergreen content that you can always come back to. So it's very useful. So yeah, just tell me a little bit more about the work you do with clients. And so you have like powerlifting clients and average clients. So yeah, what is kind of the typical work you do and challenges you help people with?
Right. So that has changed a little bit over the years. And I would say when I started, for example, because this kind of depends on kind of the niches that you're into, right? Like as a person, because for example, when I initially got started, like Facebook groups were like all the rage. Like that's where people hang out. That's where stuff happened online, really. And so I was in a lot of fitness groups that were kind of like science-based, evidence-based, because now this is like a super common thing. But like back then, people caring about actual evidence, that was a very, very restricted, number of people. And so I was in a lot of circles that kind of talked about the topic. And also, I think somewhat unfortunately, back then, that was very associated with powerlifting and strength. Like now, I think it's a bit more, I think it's more like acceptable that you train for like physique development and whatnot. But back then there was kind of like a superiority complex of strength training. So that's kind of the niche that I was in. And most of my clients kind of usually came from that type of environment. So like they saw me in those groups, like answering a question. They were like, oh, you seem to know what you're talking about. Can you help me with this? Or maybe a friend's recommended to them, and things of that nature. So in the beginning, it was a lot of powerlifting. And then I think in part because of Renaissance periodization, I eventually started to transition more to physique development. So like bodybuilding, not necessarily like competitive bodybuilding, although I do coach some of that as well, but mostly, just average people, just, trying to get, as muscular as they can, and kind of like that's their main hobby. And that's kind of what I ended up, specializing, I suppose, over the years, because then people refer their friends, and then, usually your friends are into the same thing as you are. And so yeah, it's typically like, I would say, I would say intermediate to advanced. They're generally people that, already kind of know a little bit of what's going on. So for example, almost everyone that comes to, not everyone, but like I would say like 70 to 80% of people coming to me, they're already familiar with Renaissance periodization, for example. Like they already watched Mike's videos. They already know the basics. It's just that it's like, okay, I know the basics, but I would like some help implementing it. And I would like to customize it for me, because I know the basics, but like kind of going that extra mile of like really how to optimize for the individual. And then like you might know the basics in theory, but like in practice, if problem A arises, then, what do I do? And so that's generally the context where people usually, reach out to me, kind of like intermediates just looking to try to optimize things. But of course, like I said, I have a little bit of everything as well.
Yeah, you have an extensive background over the years. So I'm thinking, what would separate, in your opinion, a beginner, let's say a beginner lifter, from intermediate? What are some of the things that an intermediate has learned, they're aware of, or maybe just even habits or practices they use that differentiate your typical client from maybe someone who's more of a beginner, new to the whole lifting scene?
Right. That's a really tricky question, because it kind of depends how you're using all these terms, and it's not very easy to pin down. But if I try to like be very general with it, for one, I would say, generally speaking, with intermediates, for example, generally speaking, adherence is not an issue, which is already completely changes the scenario of coaching. Because if adherence is not there, then you have a big problem. You need to fix that as soon as possible. So, that changes completely. Usually intermediates, because they've already been there for a while, they generally already kind of got into the habits of things. Like that generally doesn't, require a lot of concern. Beyond the adherence issue, again, this comes back a bit to definitions, but I think probably the biggest, the variable that's most relevant is how much progress have you made, and how much progress can you make? Like the pace of it is, I would say, is the big determinant of where you fall in kind of like categories of advancement. So a beginner, for example, assuming that everything is on point, they can make progress, pretty fast. Intermediates starts to get to slow down, and then, once it gets to advanced, then it's kind of snail space, right? Obviously this depends a bit on genetics, but that would be kind of the most basic framework.
Very good. And just as a side note, so would you describe yourself as a deep thinker? And I ask this because you have your podcast on philosophy, and I feel like the thinking side of training, as opposed to just, I want to look good, I want to be buff, like, sure, that's kind of nice to have, but to think about your fitness on a deeper level, would that be something that you use in your coaching, and that would separate a beginner from an intermediate, where they kind of, maybe their fitness means more to them, or they've kind of thought about it on a deeper level?
Yeah, for sure. So, I do like thinking. I do have, the podcast, like you mentioned, and I have a degree in philosophy, etc. So, I do think it's important, and I think also just fun. Like, even if it wasn't important, I think it's just fun to understand the principles of how this all works. And yeah, you're right. So like, because I was saying kind of the problem of definition. So like another variable that you can kind of try to delineate what an intermediate is, for example, also kind of like their psychology about training, and I think you're very right about that. So beginners, a lot of the times, they're just following random stuff, right? And it's not unreasonable, because like, what the hell are you going to do? Like, it's very overwhelming when you first start something. Like, it doesn't matter if it's fitness or not. And so when beginners start, they don't know what they're doing. And also, I would say that a lot of times they don't know what they're doing, and also they don't know how to reach a place where they know what they're doing. Like, not only do they not have the information, they don't have the skill sets to get the information. And this is actually super, super underrated, because I think that's actually part of what makes someone a really good coach or athlete or knowledgeable in general. A lot of times it's not just getting good information, is kind of knowing how to get it. And this is really hard to appreciate, because a lot of times people don't understand how complex it is to actually get to the bottom of things. And a lot of times this gets complex to a degree where it's logistically almost impossible. And that's why, and this actually applies to science as a whole, which is why you have experts, right? So like, you can't possibly be an expert on everything. You just don't have the skill, you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the time. And so this applies to science more broadly, and also it applies to fitness. It's like, I'm more, into this and more knowledgeable and more experienced than like 99.9 of people on Earth, and even myself, there's tons of stuff at for example, the mechanism level of hypertrophy, which I have no idea. Like when it gets really deep into physiology, like that's just not, that's just not my field. And so, but even though I don't know that stuff, I know how to get the answers. Like I know what papers to look out for. I know the basics of what determines a good paper from a bad paper. I know the main researchers involved, things like that. And so, I would say part of that process is what kind of also transitions someone from beginner to intermediate, which is like, I know a bit more of what I need to do. And also I'm understanding the landscape a little better. If it's like, if I have this question, I know roughly how I might get an answer. Or if I see several answers, I might have an intuition of what makes a bad answer compared to answer B.
Interesting. So the quote, you don't want to major in the minors, that comes to mind. And it's like, I kind of hear that that's kind of like a rookie mistake in any field. Is there any kind of rookie mistakes, beginners would focus on too much, maybe when they're starting their fitness journey, or that an intermediate has really, they've just said, I'm just going to focus on this and I'm just going to focus on that. That helps them to kind of, I guess, graduate from that beginner to intermediate level.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's a really big one. And beginners make this mistake all the time, and they make it so often that I don't even know where to start, because there's like a million things that they do wrong. But I would say if I have to like kind of think of an overall pattern, I would say maybe trying to seek novelty is one of them. So like a lot of times, if someone just gets to the gym, it's like they get a workout and they think, they get a workout, they start doing it, and then they're like, well, I need to do something else. Right. It's like they have the tendency to program hop a lot. And also novelty can apply in other ways as well. So like, a lot of the times they look things that are like sexy, right? So like in the program, it's like, if there's like, tons of like supersets or something, it's like, well, this must be good. It kind of looks advanced or something. Surely it's better than straight sets. Why would it not be? Or like in nutrition, if there's, I don't know, they might come across with like some random blog posts from, I don't know, some mother somewhere about, how blueberries are now the healthiest thing ever. And there's, in order to be healthy, you just need to have blueberries. So stuff like that, a lot of times beginners fall to those things. It's like things that just sound sexy, and also constantly in the lookout for things to try. And this kind of ties into what I was saying earlier, which is like, once you're kind of a bit more intermediate, because you understand a bit better of the fundamentals, like, what things truly matter, right? And so like a lot of times, obviously this depends from person to person, there's always exceptions, but generally speaking, when people get to an intermediate level, they at least know kind of the basic levels of what they should focus on training, right? Like, most intermediates know that, they should probably be getting stronger over time. It's probably a big one. If they want to lose fat, they'll have to find a way to eat less somehow, regardless of kind of the specifics. And so, there's a lot to be said beyond those things, but if those things are in place, then you're probably going to spin your wheels, and a lot of beginners do, really, because they don't really know how to get out of it.
It's making me think of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So extrinsically, you might be like, oh, I'll join a new gym, I'll try this new workout, this new plan. That's all extrinsic. Whereas if an intermediate, I would say just personally, an intermediate actually just enjoys training of any kind, even if it's a very tough situation, like a home workout during the pandemic, where they just, very limited equipment. It's like almost like the most basic training you could do. It's almost like the least sort of exciting way you could train, but because it's still resistance training, they enjoy it. So as someone, who's been training for a while, and you also do the bouldering, the climbing as well on top of it. So it's kind of like you actually double down and did extra exercise. Yourself, what kind of motivates you to train and to work out over the long term? That adherence point that we talked about earlier.
Right. Well, for me personally, kind of what I've always been somewhat addicted to is just getting better. Like the feeling of, and this also kind of applies to my, kind of overall life more broadly, but, in specific, it manifests very clearly. Like, because, I mean, at least as far as I'm concerned, kind of within my life philosophy, you should try to get better at things. But like a lot of times it's really hard to quantify what better is, right? It's like, you should probably be a better partner, but like, how the hell are you going to quantify that, right? If you're being a horrible partner, they'll let you know, but small improvements are just really hard to detect. And so, but fitness has the peculiarity that is just super straightforward. And there's literally numbers on that. Like, you can make a graph if you want, right? So like, if you squatted 100 kilos and like next month you're squatting 105, then, well, that's amazing. And there's no, there's no second guessing, right? Well, it's not that simple because maybe your technique was bad or something like that. But, the overall pattern is that it's very trackable and it's very measurable. And so I've always been a bit addicted to that, which is like, I'm better than what I was. And, it's just addicting to some degree to see that. And I gave the strength example, and this is a bit harder with kind of physique development, for example, because it's harder to see, but it still happens to some degree. Like, after one or two mesocycles, for example, if you're doing hypertrophy, like, it's very obvious that you look in the mirror, and you just know that you have grown a lot, right? Like, not as much as you would like, because, that's how it goes. You just get body dysmorphia once you start training for hypertrophy. But yeah, just the overall progress of it has always been, super motivating to me, at least, especially in the strength side of things. And then, for bouldering is actually interesting, because bouldering, it also has that aspect, which is it's very addicting to, like, in bouldering, there's kind of like problems that you need to solve. So like routes that you need to go, and they differ in difficulty. And to me, it's just like, once you are able to accomplish something that you weren't before, like, to me, that just feels like it's just the most amazing feeling in the world. And again, it just always comes back to the thing of progress. And you mentioned that I do strength training and bouldering, but I actually do strength training, bouldering, and running. And running also has, kind of the same metric as well, which is like, it's very nice that I can run longer, or I can run faster than I did, last month or a few months ago or whatever. So, the overall pattern is just getting better. To me, that has always been the motivation.
Interesting. So I actually recently heard that when you kind of achieve something you didn't think you could, the return on investment is like exponential. It's like, you get your squat from 100 to 105 and you think, okay, I should be, satisfied or whatever, but it can actually be like, it can keep you motivated for, like, for a long time. I don't want to say that's going to happen for everybody, but that you just have no idea basically how good it can feel to achieve something that you haven't done before. That maybe it's like your boost, your self-belief, your self-confidence, your motivation. You just have no idea how powerful that is. That compound kind of incremental progress is really powerful. So just with like getting better, I feel like I've heard that before from intermediate lifters, where they sort of gamify their training, and maybe it's not so much about like, something vague, like I want to feel better, I want to look better, I want to lift more. It's like, no, it's quite specific of, I actually want to go from 100 to 105. So what are kind of like some personal sort of like times where you've actually gamified your approach to training to make it more enjoyable, and kind of, I guess, apply those kind of intermediate skills that like a beginner just wouldn't have, because I've actually also heard from a beginner where they're like, I don't track my training, I don't want to put that much work in. And then I'm straight away thinking, oh, you're missing out, like, as in that whole game element is there for you. It's latent potential. And it's only a matter of time where a haphazard approach is it's like almost a guaranteed like demotivator, because you're going to work for like 4 to 8 weeks, and you're not going to be sure of the results at the end of those 4 to 8 weeks. And then you're going to say to yourself, something's wrong, or, you're going to find adherence tricky. Whereas it's the opposite effect. If you put the work in on the front end, and you say, okay, I'm just going to improve by 1 to 5% or 10% or whatever, that'll sustain the progress long term. So yeah, just a personal experience where maybe even a client where you've noticed this, we'll call it like an intermediate skill.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say, tracking, like you mentioned, is a huge part of it, and something that's a lot of times not very easy to deal with is that what I mentioned, that is my motivation, is often the motivation of a lot of other people, but a lot of people don't realize that's motivational until they're in the shoes, right? Because like a lot of people, they don't even get to that place where okay, it feels amazing because now I've just reached this squat goal, or whatever. So you first need to kind of put some faith into the fact that it's gonna work, that you're gonna achieve it, and that you're tracking everything, and then you'll probably feel great about it. And another good example about this is that's kind of related to tracking, but not so much of a strength analogy. Is progress pictures. So for example, when someone comes to me and they want to work with me, and they're kind of like general population, they're like just started lifting, or maybe they never trained at all, and they're usually within that scenario, kind of their goal is fat loss. I always ask to take progress pictures, and I ask to take progress pictures even because a lot of times they're very, a lot of people are very against taking progress pictures, right? Because they came to me and they want to lose fat because they don't like how they look. So like taking pictures of themselves in that state, a lot of times, they just don't feel great about it. And what I always try to say to those clients is like, look, I get it. I totally get it that it's uncomfortable, but just take them. If you don't want to send it to me, that's fine. Just take it for yourself. No one has to see it. Send it to a private email, put it on a password protected app, like whatever you want, but just have it. And because that's going to be very motivational later, even if you don't think that is. And also I've noticed time and time again, and this is why I'm so insistent with the clients that I work with, is once you do finally have the progress, if you don't have those pictures, you're just going to have regret, like a lot of regret. And then it's a really shitty type of regret because like it was so easy. Like I could have done it. It would take me like 2 minutes, and now it's gone. Like now I can never. And this even happens to me to this day. For example, like I'm somewhat proud of the progress that I've made compared to how I looked and when I was in my fitness journey. And I have a few pictures of like when I was really fat and like no muscle whatsoever, but I don't actually have a picture of like day zero. Because the picture that I have of my worst, that wasn't, even close to my actual worst. And, to me, it would be awesome to actually have, day zero compared to now. But I don't, because I didn't take those pictures. And a lot of people kind of get into the same boat as well. So, this is just one example, but obviously it affects everything else. And there's other examples, but tracking is super important. And then, just making small goals towards it, whatever those goals may be. Like it really doesn't matter. I've been giving the example of squatting a lot, but if you hate squatting, well, that's fine. Can be the bench press, can be a vertical jump, can be bouldering, can be running, whatever. But it's really hard to believe that someone is going to improve at something. And also it's really important that we haven't talked about that. A lot of the times I think it's really crucial that these goals are hard, right? It's not like you're improving, but it's easy to improve. It's not. And that's what makes it meaningful. And that's what people feel great about it. So like if you are working hard at something for 3 months and then you finally achieve it and you didn't think that you could get it, and then you have tangible proof of it, like you have the numbers or you have the pictures or whatever, then that's just going to help adherence just massively. And a lot of people, unfortunately, they just never are able to get to that state. So for example, just going to give a very practical example. So I've been trying to get the mother of my girlfriend, for example, to work out, but it has been tricky because of her schedule and whatnot. So we haven't been able to get it done. And something that always frustrates me a little bit is that, and this happens with a lot of people, is that she starts training and like she does it for a while and then she falls off. But if she did it just for a tiny bit longer, then she would be able to realize that she's getting stronger. And then I'm very confident that would be very motivating by itself. But because, it kind of never reaches that point, you just never enjoy that benefit.
Yeah, to get over the initial hump, sort of the little initial challenges, to see the progress, that's a key phase. And you mentioned running earlier. So, with my running, I think it's quite easy there's so many different variables that we can work on, like small goals, to make the process more enjoyable. And I think doing the kind of the hard challenges, the small goals that are hard, when you put that work in and you set it up right, even though there's a risk of failure, when you do it right, you shouldn't really kind of fail. That's the interesting thing I find about powerlifting, and then also running. It's kind of like, you set basically a well-structured plan. You should have not a fear so much of failure where it's like, I mightn't be able to lift this or I mightn't be able to complete it. It's more like, can I just put in my best effort, because it's at the end of the day, like fitness is really, in my opinion, it's you versus you. Even though we like to compete with other people, even though the minute me and you start talking about like our own lifting numbers and running numbers, we'll start to compare. At the end of the day, it's not, in my opinion, it's not anything about anyone else really. And of course you can compete and do stuff like that, but if you can keep it just about yourself, you make the most out of your fitness journey. So for running, do you think there's a similarity with running and powerlifting where you can set up your goals in such a way that the risk of failure is low, and if you try your best, you can make progress? Do you get that idea? Because that's just something that I've seen with powerlifting, where if you're not able to get your 1 rep max up, your 5 rep max up, you're setting up your plan wrong. And when you become intermediate, you actually hit the numbers, and you actually, again, that kind of fear of failure goes away. It's more like a fear of, can I try my best today, even though, I have all these life stresses going on. So, do you think that approach to running applies to powerlifting, that kind of gamification?
I think that's a really good point, and I think it definitely applies, and that's something that's something that a lot of beginners don't really understand. They really have this mindset of like kind of like a binary, view of like success, slash failure in training, and they always think that it's something very, I don't know, that you have to like to push super hard, and then like the results are a direct results of like a very specific session or something like that. And obviously you need to put effort in, not saying that's irrelevant, but it's exactly like you said, like most of the time it's just about having a structured plan that makes sense, and then just putting the work over time. And if you do that, then you'll get results for sure. And that's something that's very, very undervalued. And I think that's because it just requires long-term thinking. And a lot of people are bad at long-term thinking in general, but, even more in fitness. But yeah, I think there's definitely an analogy to running there, for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely something. Maybe it's just my own personal kind of like lesson learned that if I set up my own training where I have a fear of not being able to complete a certain run or a certain lift, then I think in my experience, I kind of have it backwards. I should be more concerned about not putting my best effort forward. And if I do, then it's kind of like the result takes care of itself. So that's just my own kind of side point. But yeah, running is something that I've got into recently as well. And I don't know, is it just in fitness in the industry that running is becoming more popular? Maybe, Kipchoge, the world record breaker, maybe he's like really bringing about like a kind of a boost in popularity to running. But just talk a little bit about your experience with running, so why you started it, and then how do you manage? I thought I was doing powerlifting and so weight training and running. I thought that was a lot. You're doing 3 different activities. So how do you kind of juggle doing 2 different sports and 3 even all at the same time?
Right. So answer number 1 is that you just need to be really smart about how you program it. And kind of point number 2 is that no matter how smart you program it, you're still going to make some trade-offs, and you just have to accept it. And that's okay because, when I was younger, I was very obsessed about powerlifting. And like, even though, like I said, I enjoy progress, like my mindset at the time was like, I'm just going to be as strong as possible. And at some points, like to me now, this is like almost absurd to say it. And it feels like almost embarrassing. But at some point, to me, that was literally my life goal. It was like, I want to get as strong as humanly possible. And everything else in my life is secondary. And I got a lot of from powerlifting, but there's certainly more to life than powerlifting. And so I've eventually, not taken it as hardcore. And so I've taken up running, because I like the fact that with running, first of all, maybe to provide some context to what I'm going to say first. There's always a difference between like what training is optimal compared to what we actually do in practice compared to what you actually enjoy. And so, for example, something that I struggle a lot of the times is that a lot of times I have the tendency to work harder than I should because that makes me feel good. And also that makes me because otherwise I'll doubt myself if I'm training hard enough. And so I tend to train too hard. And so, but like you said, a lot of times that's a bit counterintuitive. And a lot of times it's not that you need to work, super hard in the sense of like being super close to failure, but rather, just follow the program, in the long term. But, this to provide some context to running because, with running, I do like that feeling of like not being able to complete it. And this is that's not like an optimal approach from a running perspective. Like that's not generally how most of your runs should go. But psychologically, I just feel good when I do that. And I managed to get that psychological state much better in running than I do in powerlifting because in powerlifting or just lifting in general, because in lifting, I feel like obviously there's a lot of a mental game. But like if you're doing like your 3-rep max, like you're not gonna top that by very much, no matter how psyched up you get. Like it's just not gonna happen. You just don't have it in you. You can't just create strength out of thin air. But in running, it kind of feels like you can get more out of you just out of thin air. Like it's really hard to explain, but like if you just run as much as you can, like if you had a gun to your head, you would probably run longer. And then if after that someone had another gun into your head, you would probably run. Like it's really, really hard to pin down exactly where your true limit is. And even the science on this, it's like it's just very, very confusing. There's conflicting evidence all over the place. And like no one really knows what's going on, honestly. And to me, I just find that very, very, very liberating. And that's something that's I get a lot of pleasure out of that I don't really find in lifting. That was part of the reason kind of why I wanted to get into running. I also wanted to kind of like do a marathon just for the experience of it and also want the health benefits. So it was a mixture of things. But once I got kind of that taste, that psychological, state that you can get into, then that kind of hooked me a little bit.
Yeah, it is kind of addictive like that where there's something personally for me very freeing about running when the chips align, things are going well, and it's just kind of, it feels, very natural, like because you can be out in nature as well and you're propelling yourself along and it can feel effortless. It's quite a unique experience. It can be very, very enjoyable. So you're just talking about some of the gains you've seen with running and the progress. What are some of the kind of like, numbers you have in terms of like you started kind of like the progress picture idea. So, you started and you did this amount or, what have you seen in your running journey since you started that is keeping you so motivated basically?
Right. Well, I can give you like with running, I'm not taking it super seriously because part of, one of the main goals that I have with running is to do that marathon, like I mentioned, but because I'm also, doing powerlifting and because I'm also doing bouldering, you have to prioritize to some degree and kind of running. I'm just mostly, I'm not only trying to maintain, but like, I'm just not pushing it too hard, but you still make progress over time. And for example, something that I really noticed is, for example, kind of the most basic run that I do is like just going straight out of my door to a certain kind of peculiar, place like a grocery store that's nearby, and it's kind of like the target route that I have. And like I remember back then that when I did that, like that was so hard. While I felt like every time that I was putting my running shoes on, it's like, holy crap, this is gonna suck. And also I had this huge mental barrier because on that route, there's a particular place where it's kind of like a bit inclined, like not a lot, but just a little bit. And I used to find that so intimidating, and I used to justify it to myself, which is like, oh, this is hard, but it's only super hard because, it's just this inclined, right? And that was always in my head, like every single run. And now when I go to do that run now, and a lot of times I don't even do that run anymore, or rather I don't do only that specific kind of distance because now it's too short for me. So I usually go a bit further, or I just kind of repeat it back and forth. But now, first of all, it's super easy, at least, that initial portion of it. But also something that I find funny is that like that whole section that used to be so intimidating for me, now it's not even a consideration. Like it doesn't even come to my mind that it's inclined. It doesn't even matter. It's just, it's just normal pavement, right? And so I think, obviously there's a lot to be said about like hard numbers and things like that. So, for example, I can go through my travelogues and like see exactly what my pace was, back then compared to now. And obviously, there's a huge improvement. But, from time to time, there's always like these little more psychological, less subjective things that also kind of give you pleasure. Like another one that comes to mind is also, for example, with powerlifting. I remember the time where it wasn't any specific like personal record, but I remember, for example, when 225 on the squat just felt like nothing, like butter. So it's not like, it wasn't, too much a number of like what I can hit, but, just the fact of like putting two plates, and it's just like part of my normal warm up where it feels like nothing at all. I remember just that feeling like completely, amazing, even though it's not like a quote unquote like main goal, so to speak.
Yeah, I know that feeling where you could take a progress picture or have a specific goal in mind, and then also unplanned goals or unplanned landmarks will come up just like that, which is really interesting. So just with the running, you're talking about like, that hill where initially it was a challenge and now it's not anymore. You don't even realize it. And I feel like you're talking a little bit about like self-belief. So can you just talk a little, we'll kind of go on the psychological, philosophical side here. So it's like, I feel as though exercise, one of the real big benefits of it is that it's a really sort of, I don't want to say easy, I would say maybe straightforward way to improve a person's self-belief or maybe their self-efficacy. So like, to do difficult things, to challenge themselves, to push themselves, to kind of find out their capabilities. What are your thoughts on that? And would you think that like that would be like a selling point for exercise for people who maybe are not motivated or are kind of, they don't have the buy-in or the adherence? We could say to them, is there anything else outside of exercise that you kind of don't have the belief with, where exercise, if you use that as a vehicle for self-belief, you can actually have other benefits, not just to your health, but to other areas in your life? Do you think that's a reasonable sort of selling point?
Well, first of all, I think you're completely right. And to me, that's a huge thing, as well. Like honestly, for me, exercise is a lot about kind of putting in the work necessary in order to get that stuff done. And also that's why a lot of the times I don't do, what might be just the most optimal, because, there's several goals to it. And so, just as an example, for example, for the last few years, I've been doing, I do a run, like on 1st of January, like at 5 a.m. with, a 5 kilogram backpack on top, like a weighted vest. And I run for 5 kilometers, just like a symbolic thing. And a lot of times my girlfriend, I don't like her saying it, but sometimes she mentions this to friends or family and whatever. And everyone just looks at me and just like, you're insane. Like, why would you do that? And the answer to that is not a physiological answer. Like, I'm not doing it because it's any good. In fact, quite the opposite. It's almost all the time. It's quite dumb to run with extra weight for no reason. But I do it simply because of the psychological benefit that I'm going to get. And the fact that I'm able to do that, not physically, but harder, because no one wants to get up at goddamn 5 a.m. on January 1st. Like, that's just the inertia that I felt every single year is just enormous. But once you get it done, then you really have this, what you're describing, of like the sense of confidence that you can do stuff, and that you believe in yourself, and that you can do it, as long as you put in the work, and as long as you kind of practice the arts of hard work, I suppose. So I do think you're completely right. But in the sense of like selling it, I'm not so sure. Like, I think on one hand, yes, but also on the other hand, I think maybe going through that route, a lot of times it might make people overly intimidated, because there are a lot of times they're already intimidated to begin with. So like, if you want to sell that idea, maybe it's sellable, but like, it just has to be like pushed very, very, gently, so that people aren't scared of it. But the overall idea, yeah, I think there's definitely some merit to it. And I think that's a huge part of exercise, honestly, because I mean, obviously I care a lot about my health. I want to improve everyone's health, but like, man, this is obviously, it's a bit hard to compare these things, but like, health is one of the most important things, but like your life more broadly, of like who you are as a character, that's also pretty damn important, right? And exercise is just a huge vehicle for that. And something that I think is really underrated is that not only do you practice that with exercise, it's actually a lot easier, because like, when you get in really tough situations in life, like when you have a real problem with your partner or with your family or something like that, that's way, way harder than getting up at 5 a.m. to go for a run. Way harder. So like, my mindset is like, if I can do this basic thing of exercise, that even though it's harder in the moment, it's actually nothing in actual real life problems, then, if you're not ready to tackle that, even though it's physically demanding, the chances that you'll be able to successfully tackle other problems of life is low, right? And so obviously I'm oversimplifying it a little bit. There's tons of nuances here, but I just think this is a good overall framework that unfortunately a lot of people don't pay attention to.
It's kind of the latent potential of exercise. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. And like, it's not like a one-to-one thing. Oh, I squat a lot or run a lot, and then that means that I can, handle other life problems like much. It's not going to be like a straightforward thing. But I think it's almost like a kind of a bet, where it's like, if I can do hard things with exercise, chances are it'll put me in a better position over the long term to handle other hard things. That's probably kind of like a better way for me, like where I would look at it, because it's hard to say exactly how it carries over, because sometimes I might exercise too much and it might actually have the opposite effect, where I'm like, oh, I can't do this other thing because I did so much exercise. But that's where the whole experience and planning out properly comes into effect. So yeah, we've talked a lot about the psychology of exercise, so we'll switch it to the nutrition side of things. And an article you had was on nutrient density index. So this is something I really like to think of. It's like, people look at food and they say, okay, what I hear people say about food is, this food is a good food or a bad food. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, what the hell does that mean? It's like, what's the situation? What are the factors involved? Like, who are you that like, this food is good for you and bad for you? Like, what are your kind of intolerances? What are your goals? All this kind of stuff. So I love the idea of looking at food and just looking at it purely from a nutritious aspect. And it's kind of like, it's a spectrum of more or less nutritious. And the index you put together, I can attach it in the show notes after, is really useful. So can you talk a little bit about that and what sort of motivated you or inspired you to write this article?
Right. So this article was more kind of like me trying to fit a balance between like two opposing narratives that a lot of times you see in the fitness industry, which is like, on one hand, a lot of times people are like, they view foods in like this moralizing way, like you said, good foods, bad foods, and like these foods are like super healthy foods. They're super foods. They're going to take your health to the next level, and they're going to cure cancer and, bring back the dead and everything in between. And then there's also these foods, which are like, if you eat them, you're just poisoning yourself. You're just going to die next year or something like that. Right. And I'm obviously I'm making fun of it, and I'm putting it in very extreme terms, but I'm not putting in that much more extreme terms. Like if you literally Google right now about like X foods, like bread, for example, and cancer, you will see people arguing that bread will literally give you cancer. So like I'm making fun of it, but I'm not exaggerating that much. So there's that camp, and that camp is just, completely obsessed about, kind of categorizing foods. And that's just wrong on like a million levels. But then there's the competing aspects, which is kind of like, and, this was kind of very popularized when, evidence kind of based, quotes unquote, started to get famous. And then we had like the whole, if it fits your macros kind of narrative. And within that culture, how a lot of people usually see food, it's like food choice is more or less irrelevant a lot of the times, where it's like, a less extreme version of it is like, just eat healthy overall and you'll be okay. And that's a really good framework, but it doesn't quite capture it, because that assumes that whatever you're eating is kind of like more or less the same in terms of nutrition density. And many years ago, when I actually bothered to look at the actual nutrient density of foods, I noticed that wasn't the case. And like this article, kind of forgot how when I published it, maybe 2 years ago or something, but like that article has been on my mind for like half a decade, because ever since I started looking more deeply at the nutrition of different foods, I'm like, holy crap, this is actually, like a pretty sizable difference. So like, okay, it's true that some foods, aren't magical and some foods are going to poison you, but that doesn't mean that they're all the same, because spinach is going to be way more nutritious than bread. And then my idea at the time was like, well, and all this data, all this nutrition, this is objective data. So there needs to be a way to quantify that to some degree. And there has been some papers that have tried to do that in various forms. But I didn't like any of them, because they usually try to analyze other things like saturated fat, and then they prioritize certain nutrients. It just gets a mess. And I just wanted something very basic and very straightforward. And so my approach was like, okay, let's just grab all the nutrients of all the foods. All the foods is a huge oversimplification, because I had to make a selection. Like there's tons of nuance that I go into the article of certain limitations that this has, but kind of like the most basic foods, at least kind of within my culture, within my location, within my knowledge. And then I basically summed everything up based on the RDA, because that's kind of what matters the most. Not that the RDA is a super reliable metric. In some things it's off, but it's good enough. And it tells you the most important thing is that it treats nutrients as baselines. So like it doesn't, because a lot of the times when people speak about nutrients, kind of what they really get it wrong is that they don't take into account the actual amounts of it. Like it doesn't matter if you get a lot of calcium, for example, or vitamin A or something. If just by eating that food or by eating some other food, you already get a decent level. Like you don't get internet points by going like 5 times above what you're supposed to eat. And the opposite always happens a lot as well, which is like, you'll see some blog online saying, this food has iron, and iron's super great for you. And then they list all the benefits of iron, and they list all the diseases that you get with iron deficiency. It's like, okay, but like, that doesn't mean that it's relevant. Like how much iron are you actually getting? And how difficult it is to get iron from the basic level. And so this baseline of kind of like a percentage based on what you actually need is super important. And so that's the reference that I used. And then I basically averaged out all the foods, and I made a cap. I believe it was like to 200% RDA. So like if something had, 700% of vitamin C, then that actually doesn't impact the index, because it's capped at 200. And so what you will see in the results that I share in that analysis is that there is a difference in foods. Like some foods are actually quite different. Like they're not magical, but they're substantial. And so in my opinion, this index, or at least this type of thinking, there's limitations. And so like people might create their own indexes if they want, or they just might use it as a heuristic. But the underlying goal is to just see, okay, if I'm going to eat certain foods, like I'm going to eat the selection, because like very few people are going to like rotating their foods. That this would be an ideal world, right? That people just, they eat a new food every day so that you get the maximum variety. But like that rarely happens in the real world. So if you have to choose, from option A to option B for a specific meal, like, if something ranks number 3 in the index and the other one ranks number 50, and if you care about your health, like you might as well go to number 3. Like, I'm not saying you need to, there's adherence, there's enjoyment, there's tons of variables, but all variables equal, in my opinion, I don't see why you wouldn't have some preference of some kind towards the foods that are more nutritious. And so this was kind of like the context and my thought behind the whole process.
Yeah, I like that kind of the heuristic, like a mental shortcut, because nutrition is a minefield. Like, it's so complicated, so vast, and it's no wonder that I think that a lot of people, the general population, find it tricky. I remember having a conversation with my mom, and she was just like, one person says this and one person says that. It's like, how do you know, where to go? And I'm like, yeah, to be fair, like there's so many conflicting camps. It's almost like politics, where there's like, people on the right, people on the left. It's really like, the people on one camp are screaming as loud as they can, and they got their studies and they're convinced they're right. But then on the complete opposite side, there's a camp there, and these are people with PhDs as well. So it is tricky. And a recommendation, because I've kind of got my own heuristics or shortcuts about how to eat healthy, it's kind of easy for me to say to people, just eat a healthy diet, eat in moderation. But now that I think about it, that's way too vague for the average person, right? They don't have a foundation or a framework of what is healthy, It's like, okay, for me, healthy is no pizza ever at all. And then if I eat pizza, kind of like you said, I'm going to die in a year, And it's like, I'm obviously joking, but it's like, that's sort of their viewpoint, because it is so tricky. So is there any kind of do's and don'ts you can think of with nutrition for someone listening who's like a little bit confused? Maybe they're in that beginner stage, and it's like, okay, we definitely want to avoid this or try and minimize this or do as little as this, but we don't want it to be black and white. And then we definitely want to focus on doing a lot of this or, certain things. So yeah, is there any do's and don'ts you can think of for anyone listening?
So this depends a lot on the person's background, because like sometimes people are very confused about what's healthy and what isn't. But there's also other people that know exactly what's healthy and what's not, and they just struggle to implement it. Like they just succumb to cravings, things like that. So it kind of depends on the person's background. Like, assuming that they are a little bit confused, generally speaking, what I tend to prioritize is not so much eliminating things off the diet, but just including more of the good things. Like if I had to give one recommendation, in my opinion, that's the most effective possible. And there's kind of several ways that you can kind of like subdivide this. But, if you want to keep it as simple as humanly possible, like in my opinion, the best advice that can't really be topped is just eat more vegetables.
I was going to guess, yeah, eat more vegetables. That is mine as well. Just eat as much vegetables as you can.
Yeah, exactly. Because like, if you do that, like a lot of other things will just fall into place. And also, even though you're just emphasizing kind of like the good things, so to speak, like your need for ice cream after dinner, for example, that's going to be way decreased if you had a ton of vegetables compared to, if you had, just some pasta with nothing else, just pasta and cheese or something like that.
On a practical level, yeah, it's really useful. And also just, what about fruit as well? So, a lot of people debate fruit and, diabetes and stuff. So would you say the same for fruit as well?
Yeah, for fruits, like fruits can be a little bit abused. I think it depends a little bit on the person. For example, fruit for me is like dessert. Like if you and I'm a bit lazy, so like thankfully I'm a bit lazy to cut fruit up. But like if fruit is like already prepared and you have a bowl in front of me, like I'm just gonna eat that bowl no matter how large it is. Like I'm gonna die before I stop because I just love fruit so much. So I think it depends a little bit on kind of like people's sensitivity. Like I have a very strong like sweet teeth, and some people aren't. Some people are like more salty oriented, and that's heavily genetic. So there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, I would say that, fruit is a pretty good guideline as well. I think vegetables top it, but fruits is still not very caloric dense, right? It's not as low as vegetables, but it's still pretty good. It has, generally speaking, a good water content, good fiber content, and also something that a lot of times, for some reason, this is not emphasized a lot. I think maybe people aren't so aware of it, but like just the fact that food takes time and effort to eat, like that impacts a lot as well. So for example, if you eat an apple, like that literally takes effort and time to eat, like even regardless of the fiber, regardless of water and everything else. And so like, even though in theory, people can eat 10 apples, even if they have the strength to do it, they're probably going to just get bored of apples just before that happens, unless they cut up and unless you're me. In that case, that might happen. But with most people, there's kind of a natural cutoff. So fruit definitely has some nuances, but yeah, I would agree with you that it's definitely a great recommendation as well.
Good. Yeah, because I'm passionate about my fruit too. I'm just thinking of pineapple and how if there's like, chopped up pineapple, you can buy here in America, you can buy like huge bowls of pineapple. And I've had it happen at least once where I've eaten the whole thing. And afterwards, it's kind of like bitter or the sour taste in my mouth is like kind of messed up for like a day. And I'm just like, why did I do that? And it's like, oh, it was healthy. And it's like, yeah, too much of a good thing can be bad. So, yeah, that whole kind of idea of dessert and fruit. Yeah, definitely. I have an experience of that as well. But yeah, Tiago, this has been brilliant. We're going to wrap it up there and maybe we'll have to do another episode, but a lot of value here. I really enjoyed it. Is there any kind of final message you want to wrap up on? Anything we didn't cover or anything about your work you want to let people know about?
Well, like you said, I don't have a lot of public stuff, so I don't have like a famous Instagram page to follow or something like that. Well, I suppose if you have any questions, and if you can find me on Facebook or something, if someone needs help, then they can message me. I'm sure they can message you as well. Like I just want people to get healthier, and to get better, really. And I think that's really it, honestly.
Yeah, I have the same sentiment. It's I just want people to experience the benefits of exercise, the healthy lifestyle. I don't want to say healthy eating because that sounds so general, but just eating in a way that works for you. If you could pass that on, that would be amazing. Give people. But yeah, thanks very much, Tiago. And